The one shame about this case is that there was no true final resolution. The event occurs in 1983. We go 30 years before charges are filed. But then a judge rules that Jimmy Snuka is incompetent to stand trial. So he never gets to fully clear his name. The Argentinos never get to fully get a prosecution. There was no final resolution on the case. And that's why people continue to debate it.
You're very welcome into this week's edition of the Off the Top Rope podcast. Richie, McCormack and I back with you again to have a look this week, not at current wrestling product, but a look back at Vice's latest episode of Dark Side of the Ring, which focused last night on Jimmy Snuka and the death of his girlfriend Nancy Argentino back in May of 1983. A contributor to that programme and a man who has written about this topic extensively, particularly in his book Wrestling Babylon, is Irvin Muchknick, who is on the line with us as well. Irv, good evening to you.
Hi, Will and Richie. It's very good to have this platform. And as you guys know, I've been on other segments of Off the Ball talking about George Gibney, the Irish Olympic swimming coach, who essentially has been a sex crimes fugitive in my country for a quarter of a century. And I just want to say that the Jimmy Snuka story and the George Gibney story are the same body of work. They're about prominent people in sports or entertainment who have preyed on vulnerable people and committed violence against them. So this is a very important topic, and I appreciate the forum.
Just, I suppose, to kind of set the scene, Irv, in terms of Jimmy Snuka and when he met Nancy for the first time. He, at the time, was married. He was a pretty big wrestling star, particularly would have been a big star in Madison Square Garden where she was attending shows. She was only in her early 20s, while Snuka would have been pretty much well into his 30s at this stage. He would have been substantially older than her, was he?
Yeah, I think Snuka was actually about 40 at the time. She was 23 when she died, so she was probably 21 or 22 when she took up with him. And Jimmy Snuka was not a star. He was arguably the biggest star of the then World Wrestling Federation in the last years of the territorial era, before the cable TV and deregulation enabled national expansion, which led to a promotional war that shook out the old wrestling mafia-like system and created just a few major players, the biggest of whom turned out to be Vince McMahon and what we now know as WWE. But Snuka was not a champion because he didn't need to be a champion. He was a huge star, as you say, at the Garden, but throughout the Northeast. But for his personal demons, probably would have become, even bigger on the national stage when the pro wrestling phenomenon went more mainstream than it had ever been before.
Irv, it was another Northeast performer in Johnny Rodz who essentially facilitated this relationship because he was seeing a friend of Nancy Argentino's at the time. Nancy went along with her friend to one of the shows in MSG. They went backstage, they got talking, and essentially that's how the relationship between herself and Jimmy was formed. How early into the relationship or not did Nancy know that Jimmy was actually married and had a family down in the Carolinas?
Well, it's not clear. I've talked, of course, quite a bit over the years with her surviving sisters, Louise and Lorraine. And there's a difference of opinion as to whether she even knew that he was involved in what essentially was bigamy, having two different lives, one on the road and one at home with his legal wife, or whether she sort of knew and was in denial about it, or, as is often the case, knew but felt that he was separated with one foot out the door and that she was really his fiance. None of that is entirely clear, but you're right. It started because one of her good friends in Brooklyn was dating and then became the fiance of Johnny Rodz, who was important enhancement talent in WWF. Actually, prior to Snuka, Nancy had dated Hulk Hogan briefly. So the one really unfortunate thing I'm very proud of being the first reporter to crack this story and to have persisted with it for many years. I ought to say one of the things I'm not proud of is that my original headline over my coverage was referred to Nancy as a groupie, which is kind of unfortunate. It's a way that victims get re-victimized. She obviously had the world's worst choice and worst judgment and choices in men, but I'm not referring to Hogan there. I'm referring to Snuka. But that doesn't mean she needed to or deserved to pay for it with her life.
It seemed to be established fairly early on as well that Snuka was perhaps a difficult guy to be around at times as well. You know, Buddy Rogers was brought up that he's effectively working as a valet for him. He was a neighbour. He was helping him out almost like as a chaperone as well. And it seemed, the story at least that was told early on in the documentary, is that Snuka is in the back of the car doing a lot of drugs, particularly cocaine, while they're travelling around the country at the time.
Well, I talked a lot with the great Buddy Rogers in the few years prior to his death in the 1990s. I mean, he was the star who made my uncle Sam Muchknick's promotion in St. Louis, starting in the late 1940s. And Buddy was very open and candid with me about it. He said Jimmy Snuka was a sweet guy, but he was totally uncontrollable when he was hooked on cocaine and other drugs. He and Snuka were neighbors on Coles Mill Road in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Their wives were good friends. Rogers said that Snuka beat the shit out of his wife. Rogers did have the on-screen role of being his, Snuka's storyline manager when he turned from a heel to a baby face, got in a fight with Captain Lou Albano, and Buddy Rogers became his good guy manager. But Rogers did actually have an off-camera role as well, which was to get the highly unreliable Snuka to his shows on time and drove him around. But it reached a point where Buddy Rogers told Vince McMahon that he couldn't drive in the same car with Snuka anymore because he would brazenly snort cocaine, and Rogers was afraid that he was going to get into serious trouble by being that closely associated with him.
And that's a role which kind of Nancy takes over after that then.
That's right. I mean, the sisters described Nancy as not just his girlfriend, but his handler, who Snuka didn't have a driver's license. So Nancy drove them around throughout the Northeast Territory, and stayed in hotels with him on the road and got him from show to show. She kind of was not only his partner, but she had a job, an unofficial job.
Yeah, I was just wondering, was the Rogers appointment essentially as manager? I know in storyline terms it would have been an office call, but somebody as prominent as Buddy Rogers and as important to that territory as Buddy Rogers was in the 60s, like, they clearly had enough faith in Jimmy Snuka being a draw for them that they wanted somebody stabling to be around him. So clearly from the office's point of view, they knew that there was trouble there with Snuka.
Oh, no doubt. But he was money, he was the golden goose, and they were trying to coax as much box office mileage out of him as they could. And if that required, extra hands to get him to the church on time, so to speak, that was an investment well spent. But, as is often the case in wrestling, I mean, Buddy and Snuka did have a genuine personal friendship and relationship going back to their time together in the Carolinas. So, it's like he wasn't really the manager, but he kind of took on some of the aspects of what you might call a manager in the real world.
Irv, something that kind of stood out quite a bit for me watching the documentary, because we had two, I guess, favourable voices that ran through in Don Morocco and also in Sam Fatu as well. And I thought it was quite interesting that when Fatu was asked originally, very early on in the documentary by the filmmakers about his friendship with Nancy, he gave the impression that pretty much it was a case that, Nancy and Snuka kept to themselves, that there seemed to be very little of a relationship between Nancy and the other wrestlers that they were working with.
Yeah, the Fatu testimony in the documentary is really key, and I want to talk about that. But Will, actually, the first thing I want to say, now that we are getting into Dark Side of the Ring, and I don't want to put you guys into an uncomfortable position, but by the time your listeners and viewers catch up with this podcast, they're going to know that there's a second level controversy to the Dark Side of the Ring episode on Snuka, in which I was one of the voices interviewed in a sit-down interview taped last October in Las Vegas. But and that second level controversy is that every important thing that I said in the documentary wound up on the cutting room floor. And worse than that, they had a post-show panel discussion called Dark Side of the Ring After Dark, in which they outrageously censored everything I was saying that I was trying to add and supplement, even though they had represented it to me as a live-to-tape broadcast. So I'm blogging about that. People are talking about it in North America. Folks in Ireland are going to pick up on this. We don't need to belabor it right now, but I have a bone to pick with the what I think were the unethical practices of the producers of Vice TV's Dark Side of the Ring. Now, having said that, I do think Dark Side of the Ring was a good documentary in certain basic ways. And the basic way is that nobody who is not a complete Jimmy Snuka mark or an apologist for WWE or an apologist for the pro wrestling industry could come away from that not actually understanding, if they weren't paying attention before, that Jimmy Snuka was certainly responsible for the death of Nancy Argentino. So they did a real good job there. I think that one of the real key things, and it's a brand new element not known before, is their interview with Sam Fatu, the Tonga Kid. Because I myself, after 28 years of investigating this story, did not know that Sam Fatu was a third person in the car with Jimmy Snuka and Nancy Argentino as they were driving into Allentown in May of 1983 for the WWF tapings at the Lehigh County Agricultural Hall in Allentown.
Yeah.
And that's kind of important because it's one of the between 4.5 and 6 stories that Snuka told about how Nancy was injured, and seems to be the one that he stuck with the most, and the one that the cops wound up accepting, even though they didn't do any work to corroborate it. And that story was that driving into town, Nancy, who was behind the wheel, stopped, pulled over to the side of the road to pee, and while going down the hill near a stream, or again, a whole bunch of different mix and match details here, but somehow in the course of that fell and struck her head, and they didn't think anything of it. And they drove on to the George Washington Motor Lodge in Whitehall, Pennsylvania, and then she was stricken later. So that was the story. But in the Vice documentary, Sam Fatu testifies that he was in the car with them. There were 3 people, not just Nancy and Snuka, but Fatu as a driver. And he says there was no stop by the side of the road.
On that,
so,
that point, I just want to note that Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer tweeted earlier on this afternoon. He says that a quick note on Dark Side of the Ring last night: Tonga Kid did not wrestle at the TV tapings in Allentown, nor anywhere near there on the night in question back in May of '83. I had tried to have a look on Cage Matches listings, go back as far as I think it's late summer, early autumn into '83. So I can't corroborate whether or not he was there, but going by Meltzer's records, it seems that Sam Fatu wasn't actually present in Allentown that night.
Well, Richie, that's real good information. And Dave Meltzer, as I've said many times, has forgotten more about the pro wrestling business than I'll never know. So if he says that, then we've got confusion and, multi-level problems with what Sam Fatu said on the Vice documentary. And I do know that Fatu, the Tonga Kid, was brought in. I remember him actually at a later point in 1984 when Snuka was feuding with Roddy Piper, and Snuka was out of pocket. He was in rehab or somehow was indisposed, and they brought in his cousin from Tonga to take over that program with Roddy Piper. So if Meltzer said that, I believe it, and it makes sense, and it makes me, walk back a little bit some of the praise that I gave Dark Side of the Ring for their Fatu interview. But to the extent that it had any legitimacy, Fatu would corroborate whatever the crooked Whitehall Township cops were saying about this supposed stopping by the side of the road to urinate. And I want to say in connection with that if that was the story they accepted, there is no evidence that they ever drove Snuka around to try to find this spot where where the fall happened. There was no sign of bramble or dirt or anything on Nancy Argentino's clothing at the hospital when she was stricken that night. And I would add to this, and this is just a little twist that only what I think the cover-up artists of the Lehigh County criminal justice system could have had the chutzpah to pull off. While they didn't drive Snuka around to find where he allegedly stopped, or Nancy allegedly stopped to pee, 2 Whitehall cops did drive 100 miles to Flatbush, Brooklyn, to the Argentino family's residence to argue to them that Nancy must have had some kind of congenital condition that made her especially susceptible to a traumatic brain injury when she fell. So there's nothing about anything Sam Fatu true or Sam Fatu false. There is nothing anywhere in the body of evidence, which is circumstantial but powerful, to suggest that Jimmy Snuka was not responsible for Nancy striking her head against the wall or a blunt object. And furthermore, there's plenty of evidence that Whitehall detective Gerald Procanon, with whom I spoke on a trip there in 1992, there's no evidence that he at any time even accidentally spoke the truth to me about any of these events.
Irv, just to walk back a little bit before we actually get to the bones of the night in question, there's seemingly no doubt anyway, either written or otherwise, or that there was an abusive relationship between Jimmy Snuka and Nancy Argentino, that there was record of that. We even saw a mention of it last night before the night of May 10th, that there were incidents of abuse of a physical nature against Nancy Argentino from Jimmy Snuka.
That's correct. And of course, the main one, which actually, ironically at the time, got a lot more publicity in the wrestling cult and the wrestling community than the death itself did, was just a couple of months earlier in a Howard Johnson's motel outside of Syracuse, New York, where multiple cops were called to the scene, where Snuka was dragging Nancy naked by the hair through the hallway. He injured multiple policemen trying to subdue him. He wound up pleading to a minor charge of disorderly conduct or something, making a contribution to the local Ronald McDonald House, and it was all swept under the rug. But yes, there was a pattern of maid abuse in the Snuka-Argentino relationship, as well as in Snuka's own marriage in his own home.
You spoke to her Nancy's sisters, obviously, in preparation for your book. Did they have any notice before her death that the relationship was an abusive one, and did they make any attempt, or was any attempt made to essentially talk her out of it?
Yeah, well, the family was becoming increasingly concerned about Nancy's safety, especially after the Salina, New York incident outside of Syracuse. But there are also stories in the deeper past, and some of this the documentary covers, but a slightly different version of the story that Louise Argentino tells. It was one that she told me as far back as 1992, and that was like she and Nancy and Snuka were sitting around at the family house in Brooklyn talking. Nancy went away, and Snuka pressed Louise against the wall, and he said, "I could choke you and no one would ever know," or something to that effect. Extremely terrifying stuff. And Louise told me that Snuka had this thing about pushing women against the wall. So that takes us to a new, admittedly speculative but plausible understanding of what might have happened in the fatal incident in May of 2013. Because Detective Procanon, the day that an Allentown Morning Call reporter named Tim Blanger was writing his first day story about it, Tim Blanger told me in 1992 that Detective Procanon grabbed Tim by the shoulders and reenacted what he thought might have happened, what was the prevailing theory, that Snuka pushed Nancy up against a wall, perhaps more forcefully or violently than he intended. But again, if we're going to say it was an accident and not an act of volition, we have to factor in that there was a lot of violence in that relationship on an ongoing basis.
I suppose in terms of the narrative of what happens that we can absolutely piece together is that they arrive in Allentown the night before. Now, Snuka is going to change his story as we go through, but he goes to wrestle at a double taping event the next day, claims that he's left her sleeping in the motel room at the George Washington. He comes back to the George Washington Lodge sometime in the evening, 9 p.m., 10 p.m, I think was the estimate, and then he calls the emergency services not too long after that. That's pretty much the official narrative of what's happened between those hours, Irv.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I would add something. After the matches at the Ag Hall, Snuka went out drinking beer with Morocco and Mr. Fuji. So he didn't even go back and, he didn't even check in on Nancy until quite a bit later. And by that time, she was too far gone.
Which to me seems very unusual, because Snuka is going to say that he had suspicions that she was unwell from the night before, that she had fallen asleep, and he checked in on her that morning. You would imagine, particularly in an age before mobile phones, the first thing you'd want to do when that taping finishes in the afternoon is just to go back and check if she's okay.
Yeah, well, you said it better than I could, Will. I mean, it's just appalling that she was, treated like a piece of property. I wouldn't treat a dog like that. If she was in any way unwell when he headed off for his professional responsibilities. But, we don't really, there's nothing that Snuka has ever said in his 73 years about this or anything else that's especially reliable. And in the Nancy incident itself, I tell it's a joke, but it's not. It's a dark one. It's not very funny that he told between 4.5 and 6 versions of what happened, depending on how you count. And that's to the hospital chaplain, to nurses and orderlies at the hospital, to the police themselves. I mean, she fell peeing by the roadside, or they got into some horseplay that got out of hand, or they had an altercation. It happened here, it happened there. I mean, one of the really ridiculous things in the Dark Side of the Road documentary, and again, I give them credit for that, and I hope Dave Meltzer is not going to interject to say that what I'm going to say next is wrong, because it is. I'll walk it back for sure. But they have, but I don't think you will, because this is more in my wheelhouse. They didn't get Detective Procanon on camera. They didn't get District Attorney James Martin on camera. These are two of the key villains of the story, in my view. But they did get the retired police chief of Whitehall Township, Frederick Conjure, who made a complete fool out of himself. He made an idiot out of himself on this broadcast by saying that just because Snuka told a bunch of different stories, that doesn't mean that's anything you can go anywhere with in a criminal investigation. Everyone knows that it's criminology 101, that when the one and only suspect in a case with compelling circumstantial evidence can't keep a story straight about who was where, when, and what happened, that it's extremely important.
What I thought was very unusual about his contribution as well is he was asked a few different times in terms of the class lawsuit that was brought, in terms of the coroner's report as well, why didn't you reopen an investigation, or why didn't you look into it? And his answer in both cases was very simplistic. He said, well, we did investigate it, and it was investigated as well as it could be.
Right. So that takes me back to my trip to Allentown in 1992, which was actually commissioned by the Village Voice in New York, although they never published it. And an interesting thing about that is that the reason about the story that I wrote that got published online in the 1990s and then became a chapter of my 2007 book, Wrestling Babylon, the reason why it's not voluminously long is that it was actually just what's called a sidebar to the longer feature article that I was writing for The Voice at that time on the widespread scandals of ring boy sex abuse, drugs with Dr. Zahorian and other scandals in the WWF that almost brought down the company through that period. The Voice never published my article. It was an important juncture in my career and my life. I had to go to court to get my $4,000 fee from the Village Voice, and it led to my evolution into a writers' rights activist. And I ultimately became assistant director of the National Writers Union, and after that, a copyright litigation consultant and an objector to a settlement whose name is on the exquisitely titled United States Supreme Court decision, Reed Elsevier v. Muchknick. I'm sorry, that's a long personal aside, but the point is, I was in Allentown in 1992 for the Village Voice. The first person I saw was the coroner, Wayne Snyder, who had been the deputy coroner in 1983, and his eyes lit up as soon as he realized when I walked into the office, what I was there for. He said, "Oh, you're writing about that Superfly guy. I've always wanted to get him." And then he told me, he said, "Write this down. Upon viewing the body and talking to the forensic pathologist, I immediately suspected foul play and so notified the district attorney." So this is 1992. It's 9 years after the 83 incident. I talked I met with a group of editors and reporters at the Allentown Morning Call. If they didn't have reason to jump into that story and pursue it in 1983 or in 1985, when the Argentino family won a $500,000 default judgment in a civil wrongful death suit in federal court, they didn't have any reason to do it then. They certainly had no excuse not to pursue the story after 1992, when I was writing a roadmap of everything. I didn't have the forensic pathologist report, which the two Allentown Morning Call reporters would uncover to their credit for their 30th anniversary cold case package in 2013. But they had plenty of the fundamentals of the story to do it at any time, at any point earlier than the too little, too late, justice delayed, justice denied, a futile and failed prosecution of Snuka in the 2013 to 2017 period. So that really gripes me, and it gripes me that Dark Side of the Ring turns these two preening, hyping Allentown Morning Call reporters into the heroes of the episode when they accomplished nothing.
Irv,
now, to go back to Buchanan, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, because this maybe ties into the point you're about to make. I was curious. It's something that came up in Jimmy's book. It's something that came up in the documentary last night. What was the purpose of the Allentown police speaking with Vince McMahon in 1983, and how much truth is there in the stories that there was a briefcase with him at the time and there was one that didn't come out?
Well, I'm in the camp that doesn't believe that anything said that Snuka said was particularly reliable, and I'll address that, what my theory of what that's about. But as to why McMahon was there at all, he was called, I believe, by Don Morocco. McMahon had finished with the tapings in Allentown, had driven back to his home in Connecticut. When Morocco called, he turned right around and drove back to Allentown because his big moneymaker was in legal trouble and he had to do some fancy footwork. And what we do know is that Snuka clammed up, did his Jungle Boy gimmick, me no speak English. I mean, he was illiterate. and he allowed McMahon to be his mouthpiece. We know this because a retired Whitehall detective who I spoke to after my 1992 trip and spoke with about all the things that Detective Procanon had said to me, told me that Detective Procanon was full of it, and Vince McMahon was there acting as Snuka's mouthpiece. Now, to get to Snuka's story from his 2012 autobiography, I think that it was entirely ghosted. If you look at the radio interviews on YouTube that Snuka did to support the book in late 2012, 2013, you see that he's totally malleable. Whatever his handlers tell him to say, he'll say. My guess, this is not, it's only speculation, but either Snuka mentioned this thing about Vince McMahon walking into the climactic meeting in the prosecutor's office carrying a briefcase. Either he said that because, like a guilty person, he kind of wants to confess at some level, or it was simply what Hitchcock would have called a MacGuffin, just a kind of like irrelevant, non sequitur plot twist that maybe somebody writing his book slipped in there just for sensational gossip, commercial value. And it really didn't even happen that way at all. I happen to be of the belief that Vince McMahon did not bribe the officials in the prosecutor's office in Lehigh County for the simple reason that WWE was so important to the economy of that part of the country, where they came in every 3 weeks to do their television tapings. The circus came to town. That those people were already so much in his pocket that he didn't have to bribe anybody. But who knows?
We come around to then, I guess, the story that Snuka tells. As you say, it changes multiple times across the night of the 10th into the 11th the next morning. And one thing I found kind of very consistent about the accounts that people gave of what they heard from Jimmy Snuka was that he seemed genuinely very concerned at the point the paramedics come to when she dies in the early hours of the next morning. And his story at that point was very much about, a possible dispute between the two. He wasn't quite sure what had happened to her. And it's only really from the next morning that we start to get this story about the supposed fall when she got out to pee on the way to Allentown the night before.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think that Jimmy had genuine affection for Nancy. I mean, it was an abusive relationship, but, Ike Turner probably loved Tina Turner. It's neither here nor there. I mean, concerned is as concerned does. And at a certain point, he was panicked about being on the hook for the murder of his girlfriend. So he starts shifting around, and other people start giving him things to say that they think it might be more plausible. So I can't make like tons of micro sense out of every iteration of Snuka's accounts of what happened. All we know is that there were many different accounts. They don't add up to anything. Nancy suffered a traumatic brain injury. They had an abusive relationship. There were marks all over her body showing trauma, not just on her head. And so the case, we don't have like an eyewitness, but some cases are circumstantial, and Snuka deserved to be tried by a jury of his peers. But thanks to the incompetence and or corruption of the local authorities, we never got that. So he was never held accountable in any meaningful way.
When you have an autopsy report in 1983 saying this case should be investigated as a homicide until proven otherwise, it defies belief how it can't actually, at very least, reach a charge, never mind a trial. And none of that seems to be forthcoming.
Well, I agree with you 100% there. But I think one of the tricks was that they never actually declared the death an accident. They didn't declare it anything. They left the file open. And by doing that, they kept me in 1992 from being able to get the records because under the Pennsylvania public information law, police records are protected as so as not to compromise an ongoing investigation. So they kept the investigation ongoing. Let me say too, if I had not had my falling out with the Village Voice, I would have litigated that and would have pursued it more than I was able to in the 1990s. And anybody who knows anything about my career knows that that my public information law is my stock in trade. I've litigated against municipalities and states, before 5 different states. In the George Gibney matter, I took the federal government all the way up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and won. So I wasn't in position to do that, or maybe I would have gotten some of those records that the Morning Call reporters eventually uncovered in 2013. But regardless of whether I had all the paperwork, I had on the record statements by the coroner, and I had plenty of contradictions in the nonsense that Detective Procanon said to me in 1992 for diligent local journalists to delve in earnest into what was essentially the long-standing town secret. In that connection, I got to tell another funny story from my trip. I went to the Ag Hall in Allentown, not even to do any investigative thing, just to try to I wanted to see what it looked like from the inside, maybe for a scene setter. And apparently the word had already gotten around town, because when I knocked on the door of the office of the administration of the Ag Hall, they were closed. They didn't have any events then, but they had an office staff there. The building manager opened the door and he said, "I know why you're here, and we don't want any part of what you're doing." And he closed the door on my face. And so to give you a somewhat dated reference, I felt a little bit like James Garner in the Rockford Files when that happened.
One thing I struggle to get my head around. Clearly, there was enough information about the story, regardless of whether there was a charge forthcoming, regardless of whether there was a trial forthcoming. There was enough information about the story out there to implicate Snuka in Argentino's death. What I don't get then is why Snuka is then allowed to establish himself as one of the companies. Like, he's already one of the main draws and has been for the McMahons for a number of years now, on and off. He then launches into this, or continues his program with Don Morocco, which reaches insane heights in Madison Square Garden, culminating with that moment off the top of the cage. And then onto that, you're talking about a guy who ends up being involved in the main event of the very first WrestleMania. Like, surely any boss of any standing, of any normal company, would have looked at the events of May the 10th and 11th of 1983 and the person who was involved. Yes, they may have had a role in them not being charged, but they also would have laterally ran a mile from them. And at least, especially in those territory days, just allow them to go and work with somebody else.
Well, you're talking about the alternate universe of pro wrestling, so I'm not sure your logic obtains there. I mean, wrestling was and is a world where you have a big ticket star, you milk it and him just as much as you possibly can, and in a way that I didn't realize until I looked back on it a few years later. You're right that this Nancy's death actually happened at just about the very peak of Snuka's popularity, the program with Don Morocco. They're right in the middle of it, and somehow he powers through that. And he does though go into decline at some point after that. He is at WrestleMania, but he's not in the ring there. He at some point falls off the WWE top tier, migrates to the AWA, goes to the independent circuit, and then ultimately, like that pathetic character in the movie The Wrestler, plays out the rest of his life going to conventions where he autographs things for fans who remember when he was what he was. So I'm not sure what your question is exactly, except that, yeah, it seems like immoral and gross
Well, like
that
when you factor in
WWF would
there,
continue to stand behind somebody who probably at minimum should have been prosecuted for third-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter, but they didn't, and it was a business decision, and that's the way they roll in that industry, and I must say probably in some others as well.
I was just thinking as well, when it comes to the actual edit of what happens from here, Irv, it's quite interesting. I think you appear kind of in the first maybe 11, 12 minutes of the documentary. I'll admit I watched it without ads when I saw it on YouTube this morning. Then you kind of disappear for large swathes of the documentary. And then when it came to the after show as well, I clocked that you were on for 2 minutes and 57 seconds, which was very heavily edited, with a very strong response from Valentine within there as well. I'm guessing you said a lot more last October than what we actually saw on screen this morning.
Right. And in an article I published, we're talking on April 15th, the day after the airing of The Dark Side of the Ring. Greg Oliver of Slam Wrestling in Canada kindly gave me a slot to do my instant analysis of it, which is up today. And it's all about my comments on the documentary, which are positive to a large extent, and my disgust at how they booked me for a panel discussion, which they said was going to be live to tape, and then proceeded to chop it up and censor me with all the, with all the subtlety of the North Korean information ministry. So your listeners and viewers can be assured that in the coming days, at my site, concussioninc.net, I'm going to be writing in full all of the things that I said on the post-show Dark Side of the Ring After Dark that got outrageously, unconscionably cut out. And people can decide for themselves whether Dark Side of the Ring and Vice TV and their editors conducted themselves responsibly and ethically in my appearance on that show.
Because my recollection of your appearance, particularly on the after show, was that they asked you kind of a vague enough question about Buddy Rogers and the relationship to start with. Then they asked you a follow-up question, and you were pretty frank in your view that, in your opinion, Jimmy Snuka was the man who was responsible for the death of Nancy Argentino on that night. And then very quickly they seemed to try and move the program to an end.
That's the way it comes out in the edited version that the public saw. But actually, I'm thrown one question about Buddy Rogers. I answer it. I then say, Chris was the name of the host. I said, Chris, the most important reason for my being here is that the key things that I said for the documentary wound up on the cutting room floor. So I hope I'll be given the opportunity to make some more expansive remarks here. And Chris says to me, okay, you've got the floor. Except I don't have the floor, because what I then proceed to say jumps to like those brilliant criminologists and seventh-hand witnesses, Greg the Hammer Valentine and Brian Nasty Boy Knobs, saying, "Well, I don't know. I heard that she fell, and I don't, So it's kind of a farce. As a piece of journalism, it's a farce. As a piece of broadcast ethics, it was a farce, and people need to know that. No matter what they think of me or my work or how much they like Dark Side of the Ring, which is an interesting show, this was disgusting in my view.
Similarly, I found on the episode a few weeks ago with Chris Benoit and speaking about the Nancy Benoit situation and in the end the terrible double murder, homicide and suicide of Chris Benoit, that I thought was quite interesting that they didn't actually speak to Kevin Sullivan. And I know he spoke eventually to Cornette last Friday on his podcast as well. But from just an ethical point of view, in terms of the documentary makers, I thought it was quite interesting they didn't pursue a conversation with Sullivan, given that there was a lot of accusations made about him across that two-parter as well. So I think you can kind of enjoy the program, but still sometimes maybe question some of the narrative choices and ethical choices that have been made along the way here.
Yeah, well, didn't talk to Kevin Sullivan, didn't talk to me. I wrote the book of record about the case. Well, I was in Las Vegas last October. They said that they were going to interview me for the Benoit episode as well. And while we were in Las Vegas, they started asking me a couple of questions and then decided that they weren't really prepared. And I understand that. There's a playbook for production. And you don't just, willy-nilly use a guy just because you have them there at the moment. But I expected to hear back from them, and they didn't. I didn't. I followed up with them a couple of months later, and they said that they had moved forward without me. I guess had not intended to close that loop with me. So that was the first sign that, and this is the world of TV documentaries, which is just maybe one step removed from the work world of professional wrestling. I mean, they edit, they chop things up, they manipulate images, they have a narrative storytelling agenda that they're going to keep to come hell or high water, and they decide who they want, who they don't want. I mean, they didn't use Kevin Sullivan, they didn't use me, they didn't use Dave Meltzer, who, as I said, knows more than I do. Maybe not about the specifics of the Benoit, but certainly about this world in general. So that doesn't reflect too well on them. But anyway, that's showbiz.
Irv, I'm speculating slightly on what got left on the cutting room floor here, but I'm guessing you were quite forthright at some point with something that didn't make it in. That I'm guessing you said that you feel that Jimmy Snuka was responsible for what happened that night in May 1983.
Oh, no question. I said, and I think they have like the last sentence of it or something, but I said that, as I said here earlier on, that anyone who was not paying attention before and who is not a complete mark for Jimmy Snuka or apologist for WWE or the pro wrestling industry cannot reasonably come away from viewing this documentary and not conclude that Jimmy Snuka was responsible for the death of Nancy Argentino. Period. End of paragraph.
I think Richie and I are both marks, but I think Richie, we probably wouldn't make a defense of this. But it is interesting, Rich, as well. I was just thinking in terms of the conversation in a general sense that what does come up here is probably the superstar and the celebrity of Jimmy Snuka may well have actually coloured quite a bit of the fallout around 1983.
Yeah, like I was thinking of, on this side of the water especially, the impression that we were fed essentially of Jimmy Snuka. Like, I would have come to the wrestling industry in late 80s as a viewer, as a kid, and he's the Superfly, he's the guy that comes off the top rope, he's larger than life, etc., etc. We were still being force fed this notion up until pretty much the last 2 years of his life, that this guy was a superstar, that this guy was a trailblazer, that this guy was one of the biggest stars in the WWF, WWE, in wrestling in general, in the Carolinas and beyond. I don't think there's a full grasp in the wider world that this man is ultimately responsible for the death of a girl in her early 20s.
Yeah, well, in fairness to you guys or to any wrestling fans, I mean, the proclivity toward denial of people who, give us a lot of joy and entertainment is not limited to pro wrestling. I mean, and nor are journalistic failures to bring down powerful figures limited to this story. The New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for taking down Harvey Weinstein, but the New York Times did not get a Pulitzer Unprize for the 20 years prior to that, when they had plenty of knowledge that Harvey Weinstein was a bad guy. So I analogize that to the Allentown Morning Call. I mean, it's nice that they did like a cool 30th anniversary cold case package in 2013, but I don't think that's the story in 2020. Jimmy Snuka probably murdered Nancy Argentino in 1983. He died in disgrace in 2017 after a too little too late, justice delayed, justice denied, failed prosecution of him. So the story is that failed prosecution, and all the people who are responsible for that are still in positions of power in Lehigh County, most notably District Attorney James Martin. And that's what I think we should be talking about. Look, I was a wrestling fan growing up. I have been off and on to some extent, even through my adulthood. But I write about pro wrestling because of the prism that it offers us on the world at large. My book publisher, ECW Press, just put out a third edition of my book on Benoit, Chris and Nancy, which we're calling the Ultimate Historical Edition. And it includes a new introduction in which I talk in full about the relationship of Donald Trump with the McMahon family. I mean, both in terms of the style of his public communications and in terms of their shared business interests. Vince and Linda McMahon were the largest and first donors to the fraudulent, self-dealing Donald J. Trump Foundation, which was prosecuted by the state of New York and has now been dismantled. And the story in the news this week, if you want to get really relevant, is that the governor of Florida, DeSantis, has declared WWE an essential business during the shelter in place that is going on there during the coronavirus pandemic. And what that means is that WWE can continue without a live crowd to tape in studio their television show and get their several $100 million a year contract with Fox Television fulfilled instead of going into default. And Linda McMahon, who is now the chair of President Trump's #1 super PAC political action committee called America First, was of course in Trump's cabinet as the director, administrator of the Small Business Administration. So this is why we do these stories, not just to talk about the gossip of a star who was full of demons and had a lot of tragedy and perhaps in Snuka's case, violent crime and murder in his private life. We talk about it because we want to know what it means. Wrestling is just like the world at large, only more so.
Yeah, it seems quite remarkable as well. We obviously have the essential business decision that was made this week in terms of WWE's classification, but we saw over the last 24 hours as well that McMahon, Vince in this case, is now going to be on a committee about economic recovery after the coronavirus as well. As you mentioned, Linda McMahon has been high-powered within the administration with Donald Trump as well. It would seem to me that Vince and Kennedy McMahon is quite clever at being friends with the right people.
Right. I mean, this started out when I wrote Wrestling Babylon in 2007. The epigraph of the book is from Juvenal, where he says, it's the quote about bread and circuses in the Roman Empire. I've always felt that the pro wrestling phenomenon was emblematic of something happening in late Empire America. I just didn't expect it to play out in such stark, apocalyptic, dysfunctional ways during my actual lifetime, but here we are.
Irv, thanks so much for being so kind with your time. It's been great to talk to you. I've no doubt that both of your books are probably going to sell quite well on the back of Dark Side of the Ring, this series. It's probably going to be quite helpful for your publisher over the next while as well. And thanks a million for talking to us here on the Off the Top Rope podcast as well.
Hey, I've had a great time. Thanks for having me.